All right, I'm now joined by Jeremy Johnson, who I think most people watching this may be familiar with as a beloved character in the TMDS extended podcasting universe, and Mark Warren, who's a philosophy professor at Damien College with a rare genetic condition, meaning that he can't kick people. He tries and he falls over. It's the damnedest thing. And we are here to continue the regular Sunday series, watching and breaking down old debates. In this case, with the Hitchens versus Hitchens debate, which we started. The way this worked was so this is Christopher Hitchens and his brother Peter Hitchens in 2010, and they did a double-header debate. So the first part of it was about Iraq. We watched that last Sunday with Gene Bajalan and David Slavic, and then the second half was the religion half, which we are about to watch now. I should also say a preview of coming attractions. Next week, next Monday is going to be the Chomsky-Foucault debate with Matt McManus and Russ Briglia. So that should be fun in a different way. But tonight we get to do get in the Wayback Machine and do the throwback to the new atheism era. And I thought these two guys would both be fun for this. Jeremy, because he was doing a graduate program, I believe, in philosophy of religion. So this seemed very on his beat. And Mark, because he's somebody I always used to talk to about Hitchens and stuff, back in the new atheism era. So thought it'd be fun to get him on this too. So yeah, thank both of you guys for coming.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Ben. I appreciate you bringing my affliction to light. Letting people know that we do exist.
Yeah,
those who cannot kick.
Visibility. That's so
visibility.
People, yeah.
There are dozens of us.
Yeah, and then if people see it, right? Like if somebody gets into a fight with you and you try to kick and it's unsuccessful, then they won't laugh at you. They'll understand that it's a serious medical condition. That they need to be understanding about. So yeah, that seems good.
Thanks, Ben.
Yeah. Oh, happy to be of service. How are you doing today, Jeremy?
Doing good. Looking forward to this. I actually pre-gamed this a couple nights ago and just watched it and took some notes. And somebody in the comments is saying this is a Hitch slap, and that's certainly the case. I think if you haven't seen this before, you're going to be very entertained. There's a lot of mic drops, so I'm looking forward to deep diving with you guys.
Yeah. Oh, somebody in the chat asks when will Amber Frost drop? So that's the episode that's coming out tomorrow is the one. It's going to have Nicholas Kiersey and Jason Lee Bias, but then the one that's the week after, so premiering a week from tomorrow. Yeah. So the last episode of 2020, because we're going to take a short break around Christmas and New Year's, is going to be the Zizek and Amber Frost one. So that should be fun. But yeah, these are both, and anybody who's seen either of these guys, like they're both very like mic drop prone in their rhetorical styles, which are understandably very very similar. Since they grew up in the same house, and they even come, as we were talking about last week, they come from the same political background. That obviously they grew up in somewhat conservative household, but they both went through phases of being like college Trotskyists, and then Hitchens stayed on the left in most ways for most of his life. He obviously had what, from my perspective, are some pretty horrific, positions on foreign policy in the last decade of his life. But he saw that as something he could make a left case for. And Peter Hitchens, his brother, who, by the way, should be on the show at some point. I'm not sure when, but he said he'd do it. Went way to the right. So there's a line we quoted last week from Christopher Hitchens' memoir, Hitch 22, where Christopher says that Peter's book, The Broken Compass, contains assertions so reactionary he felt the need to wear a garlic necklace to read it. So that gives you some sense. And they're both Hitchens. Christopher Hitchens in this era of his life, was very focused on atheism and really anti-theism. The idea that that there's kind of a moral or political imperative to to combat the influence of religion, and Peter went in the opposite direction, right? Like Peter Hitchens has a book called The Rage Against God, which is I guess anti-theist. So you get an idea. So let's start it up. Let's watch the beginning.
Concerns God. The proposition is God does not exist and he is not great. A historical note, exactly 80 years ago, back in 1928, Clarence Darrow debated a similar proposition within these walls. Well, since Peter went first on the previous question, Christopher will go first on this one. Christopher, 10 minutes.
You mean you're ready for another burst from? Okay, yeah. There's something wrong with this coin toss business. Okay, let me see. I don't think it's going to take 10 minutes to disprove the existence of God. The atheist proposition is the following. Most of the time, it may not be said that there is no God. It may be said that there is no reason to think that there is one. That was the situation after Lucretius and Democritus and the original anti-theistic thinkers began their critique of religion. And I would just ask you all, ladies and gentlemen, to bear in mind a mild distinction while we go on. You may wish to be a deist, as my heroes Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine were, and you may not wish to abandon the idea that there must be some sort of first or proximate cause or prime mover of the known and observable world and universe. But even if you can get yourself to that position, which we unbelievers maintain is always subject to better and more perfect and more elegant explanations, even if you can get yourself that way, all your work is still ahead of you. To go from being a deist to a theist, in other words, from someone who says, God cares about you, knows who you are, minds what you do, answers your prayers, cares which bits of your penis or clitoris you saw away or have sawn away for you, minds who you go to bed with and in what way, minds what holy days you observe, minds what you eat, minds what positions you use for pleasure. All your work is still ahead of you, and lots of luck. Because there's nobody, even Aquinas had to give it up. There's no one who can move from the first position to the second. So I could, and I'm actually strongly tempted to, I can leave it right there. But then it's not in my nature to let off a captive audience so easily. So I'll add a couple of things. The reasons why I am glad that this is not true would, I suppose, be the gravamen of my case. Some people I know who are atheists will say they wish they could believe it. Some people I know who are former believers say they wish they could have their old faith back. They miss it. I don't understand this at all. I think it's an excellent thing that there's no reason to believe in the absurd propositions I just admittedly rather briefly rehearsed to you. The main reason for this, I think, is that it is a totalitarian belief. It is the wish to be a slave. It is the desire that there be an unalterable, unchallengeable, tyrannical authority who can convict you of thought crime while you are asleep, who can subject you, who must indeed subject you to a total surveillance around the clock, every waking and sleeping minute of your life, I say of your life, before you're born, and even worse, and where the real fun begins, after you're dead. A celestial North Korea. Who wants this to be true? Who but a slave desires such a ghastly fate? I've been to North Korea. It has a dead man as its president. Kim Jong-il is only head of the party and head of the army. He's not head of the government or the state. That office belongs to his deceased father, Kim Il-sung. It's a necrocracy. A thanatocracy is one short of a trinity, I might add. The son is the reincarnation of the father. It is the most revolting and utter and absolute and heartless tyranny the human species has ever evolved. But at least you can fucking die and leave North Korea.
That's a good line.
Does the Quran or the Bible offer you that liberty? No. No. The tyranny, the misery, the utter ownership of your entire personality, the smashing of your individuality only begins at the point of death. This is evil. This is a wicked preachment. So that's the first thing. Second, it attacks us in our deepest, most essential integrity. It's an insult to us in other ways. It says that we, you and I, could not, individually or collectively, decide upon a right action or a right thing without celestial divine permission. We would not know right from wrong if we did not have heaven's permission to do so. Where else, how else could we know? Our human solidarity, our innate knowledge of right and wrong, our acute awareness of what is fair and what is unfair, what is just and worthless to us. These come to us also as gifts from the great unassailable dictator enthroned. What could abolish our integrity? What could abolish our honesty, our decency, our dignity more than that? The third is a little more pragmatic. Religion is our first. That's why I'm so fascinated with it. It's our first version of the truth. It's our first attempt as a species. It's what we tried when we didn't know anything. We didn't know we lived on a spherical planet. We didn't know that our planet revolved around the sun. We didn't know that there were microorganisms that explained disease. We thought diseases came from curses or witches or ill-wishing or devils or dust devils. We didn't know anything from the childish, terrified, ignorant origins of our animal primate species. We come to religion. It's also our first attempt at philosophy, our first attempt at morality, our first attempt at healthcare, actually, but because it was our first, it is our worst. We now have better explanations for all these dreads, and we have cleared up all of these mysteries, yet we still dwell. And in some countries and some societies, not just dwell, but live under a totalitarian regime that forbids us to think about the progress that has been made or denies us the knowledge that these advances have in fact occurred. So it has become, where once it probably was an aid to our survival, a really great peril to our continued ability to live as a civilized species. Thus, it seems to me that in point of its proposing of a totalitarian solution to what is, after all, a real problem, to its ghastly reliance upon the supernatural rather than the much more miraculous, much more beautiful, much more elegant, much more numinous, much more harmonious natural explanations. Think how much lovelier Einstein and Darwin are. Think how much more elegant and persuasive they are than the idea of the burning bush, or the demand that without circumcision there can be no redemption. Just picture it, and then I'll give you one final thought experiment. This is what you have to believe now, if you're a monotheist. Because we now know things we didn't used to know. We know that the human species could be as much as 200,000 years ago. Did it become separate from the Cro-Magnons and the rival pre-species? Could be as little as 100. Richard Dawkins thinks 200,000. Francis Collins, who did the Human Genome Project, who's, by the way, C.S. Lewis kind of Christian, thinks 100,000. All right, I'll take 100. I'll take 100. Here's what you have to believe. For 100,000 years, humans are born as a primate species. Expectation of life, what, 25 years for the first few 100,000 years? First few tens of thousands of years. Infant mortality, rife. Microorganism disease, terrifying. Earthquakes, volcanoes, extraordinary. And fights over land, over territory, over food, over women, over tribalism. Frightening too. For 96,000 years, heaven watches this. With folded arms, with indifference, with coldness. And then around 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, but only in really barbaric, illiterate parts of the Middle East. Not in China or where people can read or think or do science. No. In barbaric, illiterate, backward parts of the Middle East, it's decided we can't let this go on, we better intervene. And what better way than by human sacrifices and plagues and mass murder? And if that doesn't make them behave morally, we just don't know what does. If there is a single person in this room who can bring themselves to believe anything remotely like that, they convict themselves of being, first, very stupid, and second, very immoral. And thus, it seems to me that the case for divine intervention or for the supernatural falls, and that we should be glad that it's fallen. And thank you.
Well, he definitely doesn't still man the position, does he?
He does not.
No, furthest thing from, right?
Yeah, it was interesting. It's interesting that the proposition they're debating is that God does not exist and is not great. That doesn't quite make sense, but let's move past that. But really, most of his argument there is not an atheistic argument. It's an anti-theistic argument, right? He only really makes atheistic points there kind of at the end, right?
Yeah. That's right. I mean, I think this is actually a general thing about Hitchens, New Atheism period, that the atheism often seems like an afterthought, or like it doesn't really actually seem central to what he's really interested in doing there, which you can see in that clip, because the first thing he says is it's not going to take me 10 minutes to disprove the existence of God, which of course is a very funny line. But then there's no point in the 10 minutes where he seems to actually try to do that.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. In fact, he speaks against the ability to disprove it ultimately or not, right? Is like
in a way
a secondary thing.
Yeah, in a way that really bothers me. That's a line that I hear in other people try to argue for it. I never found that convincing. That what he says, that it may not be possible to disprove the existence of God, but it can be said that there is no reason to believe in God. But if that's the case, that seems that you've done what you need to do to disprove the existence of God, right?
Well, I'm not sure about that. I actually thought you were going somewhere different from that. It seems like, right. So if there's no reason to believe in the existence of God, there could also just be no reason to believe in the non-existence of God. It could be that the correct position is just agnosticism.
Yeah, that's right.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you have to couple that with the unspoken premise that if God did exist, there probably would be some good reasons to believe in him. It's like, I have no reason to believe that there's a werewolf in my closet, but actually the fact that I have no reason to believe it gives me a pretty good reason to believe that there is not a werewolf in my closet, because if there was one, I'd hear scratching noises.
Right.
I should expect something to happen. And so, this is Russell's teapot. Go ahead, sorry.
Oh, yeah, Russell's teapot, right. Yeah, you want to wrap that up?
Yeah, this has always been anytime I talk to someone who has a settled position of agnosticism, I always try to nudge them that last step into good old fashioned atheism with Russell's teapot, which is the argument that for those of you who don't know, Russell's teapot is the proposition is that there is a teapot floating out in space somewhere between the orbits of Earth and Mars, and the point here is that we have no reason to believe that teapot exists. And given that we have no reason to believe the teapot exists, actually the rational thing to do is to actively disbelieve that it exists, right? And I think that a stronger case for atheism can be made than the kind of agnosticism that he opens up with.
Yeah, so I guess actually like the Russell teapot thing is a slightly different argument. I mean, it gets to the same place. It seems like the implied argument with Russell's teapot is that if there's no reason to believe that God exists, then for the sake of simplicity, like Occam's razor, we should believe that God doesn't exist. Whereas I think that might be a good enough argument, but I think your your werewolf analogy,
it's better, yeah.
A step further that it's not it's not just like, okay, all else is equal, and all else being equal, you should postulate the existence of fewer things. It's that no, really, if if God existed, we would think that we would have evidence of it. So that argument, so like to put it pithily, that some people like to say the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but like no, really, in lots of contexts, given reasonable background assumptions, it is absence of evidence.
Right.
So I should say, by the way, before we go any further here, so 255 AD asked a totally reasonable question, which is about the ambivalence that I've expressed in the past about the topic, and so I think it's worth clarifying with respect to what I'm ambivalent, right? So, which is not the actual position. I mean, if any, I think I've always been pretty upfront that I'm on Team Christopher here, but is how to think about the topic and how to present the topic, because my big problem with like new atheism has always been the sort of not the atheism, which I agree with, but the sort of politicized anti-theism, which is a slightly different thing, and it's one that's like really crystallized. Like let's see, let me find trying to remember the name of okay, so Tim Minchin has this like secularist Christmas song called "White Wine in the Sun," and somebody mentioned it, and I was listening to it the other day. It's a really nice song. I like it. It's like it's kind of funny and kind of and kind of moving. But there's this lyric at the beginning that really crystallizes like the problem I always had with new atheism, which is when he says, "To tell you the truth, I would rather have break bread with Richard Dawkins than Desmond Tutu." And I was listening to that, I was like, what the hell's wrong with you? do Tutu, right? I mean, it's like
yeah.
That's clearly a more interesting. This could be a more interesting conversation, and also an unfathomably superior human being to Richard Dawkins. So, like, and that's the thing, that sure, I'm an atheist, but like, tons of atheists are like, libertarians, or have some other, like have some other general worldview that like I really dislike. Whereas like even apart from being married to one, like I have a long-standing soft spot for religious leftists.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask you about that, Ben. Actually, you said that this has always been your problem with new atheism, and a little background: Ben and I are friends from way back in grad school. We had many booze-addled conversation about religion, and at our grad school there were some people who, almost everyone's an atheist, right? In philosophy, almost everyone, 70, 80% of professional, academic, at least analytic philosophers or
atheists or agnostics. I mean, it might be more than 20% because there are, like, if nothing else, like there are a lot of Christian colleges that have philosophy departments, but who knows, right? It's certainly a majority position.
It's kind of I got the feeling that it's sort of gauche to press too much on the importance of atheism, and I think that a lot of the atheists that we knew never even identified themselves as atheists because it just didn't seem that important. It wasn't an interesting philosophical topic, but there were a group of grad students who really cared about atheism.
Yeah,
and I think that pretty consistently those were grad students who were brought up religious. Just Ryan, Micah, me, Brian, some names nobody else knows, but these are people who were brought up religious and they became kind of stridently atheistic. I always kind of counted you in that group, not of being brought up as religious, but being kind of strident about your atheism.
No, I'm just a dick when I argue about things.
Okay, that might be that might be what I was picking up on.
Yeah,
so I think that's pretty common though online. I mean, it's a lot of folks who are more outspoken against religion have some kind of personal upbringing or some kind of biographical context for why they're so animated against religion or against theism, particularly. And even in the context of this debate, we're seeing very much a kind of historically Western traditions arguing amongst themselves, like, okay, we were atheists or we are theists and we were arguing against our previous theism. And wasn't it so weird to believe in a North Korea in the sky or something along those lines? So it's a kind of a discourse with itself, you know what I mean? Just in terms of Western imagination, Western religion. And that's how I've always seen this. And I get a lot of fun out of having conversations and going into debates, atheism versus theism, panpsychism, speaker. I love having those conversations, but I think a lot of this is for the most part, Anglo-speaking worlds battling with its own kind of history and religious history, really.
Yeah.
I
think Hitchens actually in his atheism book, he does have one chapter for you. That's like called like No Eastern Solution or something, although I might yeah. But yeah, I mean, it is interesting, that connection that Christopher Hitchens is not somebody who grew up particularly religious. That Christopher Peter's parents, raised them in the Church of England, but I think that's not a very intense thing. Certainly wasn't a very intense thing for them. In fact, he famously discovered as an adult that his mom was born Jewish, which she never shared with them, and it wasn't like she went through some sort of religious epiphany to convert to the Church of England. Like, that was just kind of like I want to set my kids on a certain path in life to private schools and the inside track to the British ruling class, and I don't get the sense that the Admiral Hitchens, their father, was super religious either. So this is actually, I guess in some ways Peter is more stereotypical there in terms of, being like intensely religious after not having been brought up intensely religious. And Christopher is maybe a little bit more unusual in being intensely anti-religious without having been brought up in a super religious way. Like, again, they were baptized. I'm sure they had to go to church, as kids, but it doesn't. At least nothing I've read by him gives me the impression that it was like a huge part of their family life.
His fervor for this topic, like Richard Dawkins's, was the result of 9/11, right?
Yeah,
that's a good question. I think so. I mean, a lot of this pushback was, maybe religion is a big problem for modernity and globalization. What are we going to do with the religious imagination and in the West and then outside of the West? So I think, even this debate being connected to the first half about, foreign policy is actually very much on point. They are related with each other.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. To be fair, if you read Hitchens' book, Letters to a Young Contrarian, which came out in 2001. In fact, I think it came out if I'm remembering this right, I think it might have the release date might have been September 12th, 2001 or something. But it was, but anyway, it was clearly written pre 9/11, and in there is like a little section on religion. It doesn't take up much of the book. I will say that it's like one of many things that makes Letters to a Young Contrarian interesting is like a transitional fossil in Hitchens's ideological evolution, along with the fact that it's the book where he officially gives up on thinking that socialism is ever going to happen. Is that in that little religion chapter, he pretty much says everything that he would go on to say in God Is Not Great and elsewhere. Like the whole critique of religion is already there, pretty fully formed. But I will say, like, he seems a lot less intense about it at that point. Mm-hmm. Like I don't think he had quite the emotional fervor that he'd have about it later. And I think Jeremy's right that a lot of that was 9/11 and drawing some kind of point. Like, yeah, thinking that the takeaway that you should have to from 9/11 is that fundamentalist religiosity, and by extension religiosity in general, is this huge threat to the world. And also, frankly, I think maybe the fact, so like, all right, so on one level, it's like part of the package with the bad foreign policy views. Although on another level, maybe this is totally unfair, but I've always suspected, or I've long suspected, that maybe part of it was like compensation that he didn't want to spend all of his time arguing with liberals and progressives and leftists. He wanted to still feel like he was somebody who would piss off the right, and this and this gave him a way to do it. Like if anybody's ever seen, there's a classic appearance by Hitchens on Sean Hannity after Jerry Falwell died, and he goes balls out for that. I mean, he says at one point in that discussion that Falwell was so full of shit that if they'd given him an enema, they could have buried him in a matchbox.
Wow.
So that might be part of it. But anyway, to cycle back to 255 AD's question. So my ambivalence, I think when I was in philosophy grad school, I was, I think, much more focused on arguing about philosophy, which is an activity I've always enjoyed, and I think that's something that has I think it's fun in a particular way because it's an intersection between arguing about philosophy and arguing about something that normal human beings actually care about. So yeah, I mean, I was certainly very happy to, merrily engage in those debates. And it's something, and this might be what 255 AD was referring to, that it's something I've thought about now, because there's that YouTube channel, Modern Debates, which is where I've gone on there a couple times to argue with people about abortion and racism and Trump, and that channel hosts a lot of religion debates, and it's crossed my mind sometimes, that'd be fun, revisit that, do something a little bit like this, right? And that just sounds like a fun thing to do. And honestly, my only hesitation about it is that even back then, I never really bought into this idea that there was some great moral or political imperative to convince people that I was right about metaphysics. And now that I'm doing the rest of this stuff, I would be slightly worried that if I did that, people would get the impression that I thought that there was, that that this was tied into some sort of political program for me, so that I associated it with that political program, so that I had to, convince the world, to agree with me about metaphysics. So if I ever did it, I'd want to be very careful about trying to make that clear. But more than happy. Look, the point of this series is to watch fun and interesting, old debates and comment on them. So it certainly falls into that category, and might even do a couple other these as it goes on. But I do want to cycle back to Mark's point that he started us with, which is that Hitchens doesn't really he does the thing that he so often does in these debates, which is that he really pivots from atheism to anti-theism. That if you read Atheism book, God is Not Great, in that book, he does due diligence and like talks about the major arguments for the existence of God and why he doesn't find them convincing. But that's like, okay, he was going to write a book, so he's going to do that. Generally speaking, my impression was always that like the actual argument about the existence of God like never quite held Hitchens' attention. That that just wasn't where the fire in his belly was, and like sometimes this was really bad. Like Hitchens did a debate with William Lane Craig. But, yeah,
William Lane Craig, you don't want to screw around with. He knows what he's doing.
Yeah, exactly. So William Lane Craig, for anybody who doesn't know, was a was a famous theist and Christian philosopher, but somebody who's actually doing like technical analytic philosophy at a pretty high level, and whatever you think of whether his arguments are persuasive or not, like you need to know, like you do need to get in the weeds and be able to like think very carefully about like, okay, if there's some sort of sophistry hidden here somewhere, where is it? Or else it's going to look real bad. And Hitchens looked real bad because he just couldn't bring himself to like really engage Craig on the details. So I think like to the extent that we could even use that language about winning and losing or whatever, which I always thought was like a slightly funny way to talk about debates. But like in this case, yeah, I think Craig definitely won that one.
I think I watched that debate years and years ago. I mean, maybe right after it came out. And I remember there's a moment in the exchange after, Craig's gone on for some bit, and you get the sense he has sort of impressed Hitchens with his intellect, but Hitchens pauses and says, I don't get the sense that you're the kind of person who believes that there was a literal Adam and a literal Eve who was put on earth by God. And Craig pauses like, yes, I do believe that. And it's one of the few moments where Hitchens he's at a loss for words. He doesn't know what to say to that.
Yeah. Well, I think, Hitchens, the way Christopher Hitchens is positioning his, not really steel manning the opposition in this debate. It's very much, cartoonish visions of dictators in the sky, et cetera, et cetera. And if you actually are engaging with somebody, let's say in the tradition of liberation theology, the kind of comminglings of Christianity and Marxism, for instance, or through like Terry Eagleton or through Charles Taylor, there's interesting conversations and arguments to be made about the significance of religion, where it's not just, the big baddie that needs to be removed in the era of globalization. So that the arguments are there, it's just that I don't know if Hitchens really can do what he does in that context.
Yeah, so I guess I want to separate out two things. So on the one hand, so as we've been talking about, like Hitchens would kind of get bored with arguing about the existence of God and divert to what he really wanted to talk about, which is this kind of humanistic moral critique of like Christianity and other Abrahamic religions as a belief system. And then on the other hand, there's like the actual merits or otherwise of that critique. And I'm probably more sympathetic to it. Like, I think that, again, I think like liberation, theology is great, but I'm also not sure how much that really avoids some of this, because even if people are kind of honing in on the good parts of the Christian moral message, and they're certainly using those to noble political ends, and finding ways to sort of fuse the poetry of Christianity, with those, with that political program, which certainly I'm all for, because I don't think that we're gonna get. I don't think that it's in the cards that that we're going to get everybody to be an atheist, and then we can talk about politics.
Right.
So we do need that, but at the same time, I think that a lot of the points that he's making, when he says it's like a celestial North Korea, it's like, okay, well, is that like a caricature? Is that a straw man of what Christians actually believe? And I guess maybe we have a disagreement here. I'm not sure that it is, because I think that what he's honing in on is the idea, is like basically elements that are pretty central, at least to any kind of theologically orthodox, small o orthodox Christianity, which would be the idea that God is omnipotent and omniscient, right? So literally knows what you're doing all the time and what you're thinking all the time, and then applies divine reward and punishment for doing those things. Which again, I mean, like there are. I mean, I understand there are Christians who reject elements of this, but like certainly historic Christianity and any like, I don't know, like Catholic bishop who's like kind of liberation theology, and has like great political beliefs, does believe those things, right?
And the vast majority of self-identified Christians who exist now, right, in America. Maybe worldwide, right? That's important.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the vast majority of Christians, including the vast majority of Christians who have good politics, do believe that God is all-seeing and all-knowing and applies reward and punishment, in the afterlife. I mean, those are pretty central to, like, I mean, I'm not going to do the thing and argue about what counts as real Christianity or not. I think that's kind of a silly way to talk, but like, certainly that's pretty central to standard Christianity.
Sure. Yeah, certainly. I think I take the pragmatic approach maybe with this question, which I think you really kind of already mentioned, Ben, in that, we're not going to get the world to become all atheists. And so the religious imagination is probably always going to play a part, not only in the history of secular thinking, as like Charles Taylor talks about, or Eagleton talked about with the Christian elements in Marxism, for instance, with Marx, is just part of the history of thinking. So the religious imagination is always going to be here. So it's good for us to sort of work with it, with what we have. But it's also, if we do that, we're not going to have fun debates like this, where, there's a deep polemic, right? Where you got Peter Hitchens who's going, I find atheism detestable morally, etc. And then you have Christopher Hitchens going, I find, theism morally detestable. And
right. No, and so I think you can, and I think you can have both, right? I think you can have, you can have that pragmatic posture. You have, I mean, look, all I need out of anybody politically is just a commitment to pluralism. That's it. That like
sorry, it's just what?
Is a commitment to pluralism. That's it, right? Like that we're going to have like a pluralistic society with the separation of church and state and all that stuff, right? Like, and there are plenty of progressive Christians who are on board with that, and so I'm more than happy to ally with those people, and then hopefully at some point in socialist future, when all our material needs have been met, we'll have a lot more time to argue about shit like this.
Exactly.
But on that note, let's watch Peter's opening statement.
Peter, 10 minutes.
10 minutes. Yeah. Well, I can tell you're all enjoying the post-Saddam era, which we were told was so good. I wonder whether an invasion of the celestial regions might now be in order, and we could then have a post-God era, which would be of similar delightful quality. I am amazed when confronted with this argument how little my brother seems to know of that which he attacks, how he prefers to mock and belittle, how he prefers to select from it all those things which I think most educated believers themselves are troubled by, how he imagines that people other than himself do not seem ever to have been troubled by the things which trouble him, and nonetheless have come to the conclusion, despite all, that belief in a God, in my case, God, going by his first name, that belief in God is nonetheless wise, beneficial, and good, not just for ourselves, but for the universe. If only the, how shall I say, the flippant jeering tone could be abandoned for a moment, and we could discuss this more seriously. It seems to me to be incurious to the point of tedium to examine the universe and not to ask yourself certain very powerful questions. The first of which is, why is there something rather than nothing? The second of which is, since we do not know anything at all about our origins and must work out what we think we know from extremely scanty evidence, that it would be unwise to form absolute certainties.
Wrong.
Now, the character of the book, God is Not Great, which my brother wrote, is one entirely of the jeering, the mocking, the caricature, the picking out of that which is bad. What? I do not think. I do not think that this. Sorry, did you wish to intervene? No, sir. Please.
I'm telling him not to.
You sure? I mean, I need to know.
Stop,
Absolutely.
stop
No, right. That's the end of the Christian charity for the moment. Had it been couched, of course, in a more generous tone, it would have been less fun to do, and who knows, there might have been other consequences in the bookshops. I don't know. But since it wasn't couched in that tone, that is what we have to argue with. And I would simply say this. First of all, for a while, and I'm surprised he hasn't asked it tonight, my brother would go around saying that there was a question which no believer could answer about what action could no believer take which an unbeliever could, or something of that character. To which I would reply, the question of morality is utterly irrelevant to you if you genuinely believe that which you say you believe. If you think that there is no authority, if you think that we are the products of random chaos, if there is no reason for the existence of the universe apart from a series of accidents, then you may behave exactly as you wish. Now, in the case of Christopher and his ally and colleague, Professor Dawkins, I refer to this as luxury atheism. I know where they live. They live in very pleasant parts of very pleasant cities, and they are able to advance the theory of atheism purely as a theory. Well, I live in England, and I don't need to travel very far from my home, which is not far from Professor Dawkins's home, in Oxford, to find a large number of highly practical atheists. In my country, it is common, no more than 3 or 4 times a week, to read accounts of people being kicked to death by youths aged between about 13 and 17. It invariably ends with the phrase, and then they started kicking his head as if it were a football. These accounts grow more and more common. If you venture into the areas where these people live, you will find a complete absence of any kind of moral feeling whatsoever, a complete absence of self-government among the strong, among the healthy, among those who are able to control and take advantage of their neighbors. Christianity and everything that went with it have vanished from among them. They are practical atheists, and they really mean it. In fact, in some ways, they're not atheists. If you examine my country carefully, you'll find that the worship of Moloch, the slaughter of children at the rate of 180,000 a year in the womb continues, that the worship of Mammon is out of control, that the worship of Ashtaroth is pretty well advanced as well, and a number of the other pagan gods. They're way out in front of the dear old Anglican Jehovah in whom I attempt to believe. All this seems to me to point to an important factor in religion, which is why it seems to me that it is reasonable, given that we are ignorant of the answer as to whether there is or is not a God and cannot know, why we might reasonably think that it was worth believing in such a being. If the universe does have an order, if it does have an origin, if there is running through it an eternal law, then wouldn't it be a good idea to try to find out what it was and to seek to govern ourselves by it? Now, I too have been to North Korea, and I will tell you that I have the opposite impressions to that which my brother had. This is a country entirely run by people who hate and despise the idea of God and who have made themselves into gods. And that, indeed, is what so very often happens when people ignore the very, very earliest part of the Bible, in which the serpent says to Adam and Eve, "Eat of this fruit, and ye shall be as gods." This is what we do when we decide for ourselves that there is nothing above us. We destroy authority. We destroy all the things which turn the hearts of the disobedient to the wisdom of the just. They're going very rapidly in my country. I suspect that if things proceed as they are in our educational system and our trash culture, they will happen pretty rapidly in this one too. And then you will know what happens when God is truly absent, not because he isn't there, but because the only place he can occupy lies within our hearts. And either he is there because we invite him and we seek his assistance in the governing of ourselves, or he is not, and we cease to be able to govern ourselves because we no longer know how to do so. There are many forms of morality. I'm told that human solidarity is a way of running the world. Well, up to a point it is. But the problem with human solidarity is that it operates at different levels. And when I lived for some years in Moscow, it was folly to expect anyone to hold open a door in the Moscow metro. Big, heavy steel and glass doors they were too, because nobody there knew anything about manners. They let the thing swing back in your face. And if I ever held the door open for somebody else, as I did in my naive early weeks in that city, they'd look at me as if I were mad. Now, something similar has begun to happen to me in Britain. I'm walking down the aisle of a crowded train, and I see somebody coming the other way, struggling with luggage, and I think, well, I'll step out of the way and let them pass. Well, increasingly, the people behind me think I'm having a heart attack, so they barge past me. The breakdown of general assumptions about what is good affects the way that everybody behaves. You cannot have a private morality and very long if the public morality is declining. And I say there are three stages of this. The whole is solipsistic. I will do what I want when there's nothing but left and right. And left is that way, this way, and it's the other way if I turn around. And then there's what you might call the shipboard morality, where there's port and starboard and there's fore and aft, but they change when the ship moves. And then there's the universal one, which flows from the universe, where there is true north, and where there is no difference ever about which is right and which is wrong, and which is the root of all authority. The authority of the state, which places power under the law. The authority of the family, where the parents rule the children. The authority of the country, where the people govern themselves under a law which all accept. All these things derive from that understanding. Without it, we're lost. Why sneer at it? Why seek to bring it down? Why mock it? Why make silly jokes about circumcision? This is far more important than that. I really do wish you treated it seriously for once.
So,
Mic drop.
yeah.
It's mic drop
Yeah,
again.
for sure. So we need to believe in God. So we need to spread belief in God. So Russians will hold doors open for British expats.
Here we go.
I mean, I don't know. Like it's a very small detail, but I mean, like I have to say that did seem like the funniest part of the presentation.
I like that more and more people are pushing past him on the tubes, because he assumes they think he's having a heart attack. That's a nice detail too.
I mean, I don't know. I live, I lived for 3 years in South Korea, which is, which is, at least not a country dominated by atheist communists. The urban centers are increasingly Christian, although there's although I guess the overall majority of the country is still Buddhist, and so I don't think in that case you can blame communist atheism for it, but I can report that in Korea, the prevailing cultural mores about, jostling onto subways and stuff are very different from the United States. I think that might just be different countries are different.
One of the things that's one of the most common responses to these sort of like new atheist arguments is, whether it's Sam Harris or Christopher Hitchens or Dawkins or whatever, is the regret that theists express about the flippant, jeering tone of their dismissal of a religious tradition. And I kind of get that. I mean, I pointed out that Hitchens definitely hasn't steel-manned the religious position, but I do have to say, I suspect maybe of the panel, I'm the one who aligns the most, I don't know, I guess, right? The most new atheisty of the three of us, perhaps. I mean, I certainly was disillusioned with the whole project as I saw what sort of YouTube libertarian neckbeard assholes it produced. And I agree with you, Ben, that it certainly shouldn't be on the top of our list, the top of our to-do list. But I still have some anti-theistic inclinations. I wouldn't mind putting together. I think I've got a kind of master argument in the back of my head about like why all things being equal, we should press back against religious belief. I don't think it's that important, but I think that there are reasons. One of the things that I found actually useful, and that I still kind of think might actually be useful from the new atheist movement, was that it did introduce into conversation the possibility of taking a sneering and dismissive tone towards some of these mysteries. I actually think that can be taken to unfortunate extremes, but I think opening that up in the public discourse as a possible maneuver one could make actually might actually be a little valuable.
All right, so we got to vote for sneering, and I guess, I will say, before adopting again a more critical tone, that somewhat along the same lines as the complaint about the Moscow subway station. Honestly, saw somebody in chat saying that we couldn't have, liberalism and the enlightened. Here we go. Enlightened Commie says there's no liberalism, enlightenment values, or human rights without Christianity, and I think that's just flatly not true. Like, I think almost no matter how you mean it. So if what you mean, I mean, of course, it's obviously not true if what you mean is you can't have any of those things without the people who are upholding them, believing in Christianity, right? I don't think the commenter means that, because I think that would just be too obviously not true. But I also don't think that's true historically. Like, if you read the last chapter of Against the Web, there's some stuff there taken from Amartya Sen, where Sen is talking about like various like strands of Buddhist and Confucian thought with support for some degree of religious pluralism in there. Like, I think that in the particular pathway that Europe took to Enlightenment liberalism, was one that was taking place obviously in a Christian society. But I don't really see any reason to think that like if Christianity had never existed, that couldn't happen by a different pathway. And I think that it's. I mean, honestly, I think the most direct connection historically is just that. Is just that a lot of the initial support for some sort of values of religious tolerance came from like horror at the kind of like wars of the Reformation, and all of that. But I don't, I suspect that that's not what the commentator means. But in any case, look, I think we've said with Christopher's initial presentation that he's immediately wandering away from the subject. And Peter is doing the same thing here. Peter would have been well within his rights to say, "Hold on, I thought we were talking about whether God exists, and you haven't really, other than some vague gesturing in the direction of Darwin and Einstein being beautiful and compelling, and I guess whatever sort of implicit, Russell's teapot argument you could squeeze out of, what he's saying about the lack of a reason to believe in God. Other than that, right? You haven't given me any reason to think no, right? So here are all the reasons to think yes. Here are all the arguments you haven't addressed, but he doesn't do that. In fact, he seems to be very quick to. I think this may have been the point, Mark, when you started heckling him, that he seems very quick to concede the lack of any sort of evidential reason to believe in the existence of God. He immediately pivots to a moral imperative to believe in God, so that people, that youths don't kick people to death.
Yeah, he says that. Well, I mean, that was why I leaned in with my Trumpian wrong into the mic, because he says that there's scant evidence about where we come from, and that's offensively wrong. Right? We know so much about where we come from. There are limits to what we know, but we know so much shit about what sort of creatures we are, where we come from, what sort of universe we live in. And I just hate when people try to muster up some mystery where there isn't any to build the case for their religious beliefs.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think with this, I mean, particularly Peter's argument here, I mean, he does quickly veer into arguing for, well, people are acting this way because they don't have that kind of internal police force that Christopher was talking about in the opening statement, that we need that, and somehow that we can credit the enchantment of Mammon based off of the lack of a theistic belief system, right? But my problem with this is not so much like, the ins and outs of this particular argument, but rather more to what you're saying, Ben, about the, in Michael's book, this idea that we can come to these humanitarian and empathy-oriented practices and beliefs in various ways. It may be through religious tradition, particular to, Western history, but it may be also through Buddhism, and maybe also through some kind of secular practice in some other area of the world, in some other context. The human beings are just sort of wired to think in this way and do this in very creative ways. So for me, it's like, my argument would always be the religious imagination is important, or not, when it comes to ethics and practice. And we can't really blame it, for the lack of a particular ethical behavior, or for a particular ethical behavior in any kind of totalizing way. I think we're just much more malleable than that. And as Mark was saying, we know so much about our history. We know how malleable human societies are. It's kind of dovetails in with, David Graeber and anthropology and that kind of avenue of thinking. But yeah. But I still have fun.
Jeremy, when you say we can't blame the religious imagination for, we can't blame it for particular evils, or I'm sure you're not going to say that like there are no particular evils we can pin on religiosity, right? So right, exactly. We can't blame the religious imagination in a sort of totalizing anti-theist or anti-religion way in the way in which Christopher Hitchens is talking about religion. And I don't think Peter Hitchens is right either in that sense, in that we can't blame secularity on evil in a sort of totalizing way, rather, totalizing. Sorry.
Oh, well, that the lack of a belief in God or a kind of a higher power is why we're doing evil deeds in the world, because we don't have that built in, or vice versa, that the belief in some kind of totalizing grand power, permitting us to do some kind of evil act is why we do evil in the world. I think they're both kind of deeply polemicized in the wrong kind of ways. I think they're both wrong about why to argue for or against religion.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I mean,
but like you can pin the Spanish Inquisition on a particular expression of that religious imagination.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, okay. I would say historically you could the history is malleable, and it may be a secular reason, there may be secular ideas, there may be religious ideas for why humans do bad stuff to each other, right?
Mhm.
But
Yeah, right. Like, and it's very. I mean, one problem I've always had with this, when you have these debates about how to do like the utility calculus for religion leads to more harm or religion leads to more good, is that it's so incredibly difficult to disentangle like all of the causes of any given thing that happened historically, right? So especially given, I mean, and this is even like feels silly to say, but I mean, this is the task that you're setting yourself when you ask questions like this. Okay, the Spanish Inquisition was obviously extremely horrific, but I think if we're going to ask the question, is religious belief, something that's caused more harm than good, then you have to ask this question about like, okay, so it's not good enough to just say the Spanish Inquisition goes on the harm side. I mean, it certainly does, but then you say, okay, so what would the version of Spanish civil society that existed at that point that didn't have religion in it? What would that be like? And I think I don't know the answer to that question, but I do think that it's not plausible to like. The thing that I do find a little sus in some of the like new atheist rhetoric about this stuff is that it almost suggests that if not for their religious beliefs, then people in whatever 15th century Spain would have found their way to enlightened pluralistic 20th century liberalism. And it's like, well, no, probably not, right? Because there's a whole historical trajectory, leading people there, and I mean, at best, that's unknowable, right? Like, and so, and it just seems like there are also larger factors there that whether you have that kind of Enlightenment liberalism does depend a lot. Like, I mean, I think that is intimately linked to whether like you're organizing your society along the lines of feudalism or capitalism, that's there are things going on here other than what people's metaphysical beliefs are. None of which is to say, I mean, obviously, really, like various religious beliefs have had absolutely horrifying consequences, and it is contrary to what Peter Hitchens is saying here. It's much harder to pin specific bad deeds on atheism, if only because atheism is I mean, like by definition, it's a purely negative belief. It's not, it's thinking there's no, it's thinking that the claim that God exists is not true, right? That's all atheism is. So you can't, it'd be much simpler if you could say, oh well, the Great Leap Forward happened because of atheism. And it's like, well, no, I mean, like if nothing else, they're like, yeah, the government that carried that out was atheist, but like they also believed a bunch of other shit that might be a little more relevant here than what their beliefs were about God or the afterlife. And even with Peter Hitchens's gangs of youths kicking people, which somebody pointed out in the chat that this is actually oddly sort of sounds like an argument against gun control. Would you rather just be shot, or would you rather have your head, kicked in like it was a watermelon? Like that sounds like a much more prolonged and worse process to me. But are these gangs of youth acting this way? Does this actually have anything to do with secularism? It's not obvious. I mean,
it's an empirical question, right? Just like the other one, it's an empirical question, but it's actually one that's easier to track. We can go and look at countries that have higher percentages of non-believers and see if this thing he's predicted has actually come to pass. And, Netherlands, France.
Yeah, right. In fact, Netherlands and France probably have almost certainly, I think, have a higher proportion of non-believers in the UK. And if they also had much less, street crime, then that seems to answer the question. And really, even in terms of like this sort of specific picture that he's painting about youth gangs and everything, like I don't know. I mean, I want to know what the stats were about this for like Victorian England, right? You know, like when you can't blame, you know, secularism and atheism, you know, for it. And I think that, and this is, so there are two distinct issues here that are probably worth teasing apart. And one of them is the meta ethics issue. And then the other one is the like practical issue. So the practical issue is it actually the case? Well, actually, I guess it's probably clearer if we do it the other way around, right? Start with the meta ethics issue. This is what he's saying. Like, okay, you can have shipboard ethics, which I'll admit that I initially heard as shipboard and I was really confused. But you can have shipboard ethics where there's, okay, what's, you know, what's port side or, you know, starboard side on the ship, but that shifts as the ship moves around, which I guess is like a sort of poetic way of saying you could be a cultural relativist about ethics or something like that. But you can have universal ethics, which comes from the universe. And so the suggestion is there that there's this deep link between having, you know, between thinking that they're objective moral facts and thinking that that God exists. And even though I'm actually like not like super friendly to objective moral facts, I think that you know, I mean, I think that I'm a fan of, you know, compassion and egalitarianism and all of these things, but I don't necessarily need to think that the universe agrees with me to care about those things. But also, it is worth mentioning that there is at least an argument that's convinced a lot of philosophers, including a lot of theists, that the connection can't quite be what Peter Hitchens is indicating there, which is, I'm always wonder if I'm mispronouncing the Greek, but the Euthyphro argument, you know, which a version of it goes back to Socrates. The Socrates version, it's a, you know, he's talking about whether what's holy is holy because the gods love it, or vice versa, but stripped down and presented in the form that's most immediately relevant. It's the dilemma is supposed to be this, which is, okay, if you believe in divine command ethics, the idea that this objective morality, this non-ship morality, I guess this ship morality and sky morality maybe, right? This objective morality comes from God. Well, okay, hold on. So is the connection between God and objective morality supposed to be that morally good things are morally good because God commands them, and morally bad things are morally bad because God commands you not to do them? Or does God command you to do them or not do them because they're morally bad or good? And if you say God commands you to do them or not to do them because they're morally good or morally bad, then the religious, at least as far as the objectivity of ethics, the religious element end up just being redundant. That if God commands you to do morally good things because they're morally good, they must be morally good for some reason other than God commanding you. And conversely, if morally good things are only morally good because God commands them, then the, you know, Plato's objection there would be, hold up, or to draw out the implicit thought, if God commanded, like, you know, if Moses had come down from Mount Sinai with tablets saying, you know, thou shalt kill who annoys you and kick them to death like a watermelon, and thou shalt not, you know, be charitable or kind or help little ladies cross the street, then would kicking people to death therefore be morally good, and charity and kindness and helping little old ladies cross the street therefore be morally bad? And a lot of people's initial reaction to this is to say, well, that's just silly because God is good and God wouldn't command those horrible things. But notice that ends up reverting to the second horn of the dilemma, because if you say God is good so he wouldn't command such horrible things, then you think that those things are horrible for some reason other than that God tells you not to do them. So I mean,
it also, that particular horn of the dilemma also renders God's commands arbitrary, utterly arbitrary, right? Because if God either has a reason for telling us to, you know, not lie or steal or whatever, he either has a reason or he doesn't. And if he has a reason, then it seems like those reasons are actually the thing that ground the goodness or the badness of the thing. Or he doesn't, in which case he's just randomly. He could have commanded killing puppies just as easily as he commanded us to honor the Sabbath.
And doesn't this get into like the Spinoza kind of argument about God and immanence, right? I mean, if it is just part of the universe to do this because it is good, right? It's sort of a universal principle, then, you know, God becomes immanent to the cosmos, right? If it is part of the universal quality of goodness to help one another or something along those lines, and not just a judgment, then God becomes synonymous with the cosmos, right? I mean, I don't know if I haven't read Spinoza in quite a few years, but I'm hearing an imminent argument here for the nature of God and the cosmos that Peter Hitchens seems to be arguing for.
Yeah, and there are ways that you can try to answer this. That like you can talk about the like the innate moral character of God and stuff like that. But that, I don't know, like all the attempts to sort of do like more sophisticated versions of divine command ethics, try to get around this, always strike me as kind of pushing back the question. Like, okay, so why is this God's character, or whatever? Like it just sort of seems like the same question again. Now, you could go along with everything we're saying, and even though at this point the bit about relativism, the shipboard ethics, would be less relevant. You could still salvage a big part of what Peter Hitchens is saying, because you could say, okay, fair enough. Maybe we don't need God for objective morality, or really like postulating the existence of God doesn't actually help make sense of objective morality. But maybe the question isn't about moral facts. Maybe the question is about moral motivation, and so. Sure, there could be objective moral facts one way or the other, but people won't be motivated to care about them if they don't believe that there's a God. Without that divine justice, then it's people are going to stop caring about this, and they're going to and they're going to act in all these horrible ways that he talks about. And actually, I would be fascinated. Unfortunately, it's been a while since the first time I watched this, so I don't remember for sure. Unfortunately, I don't think that Christopher brings up Norway and all that, which I really wish he would have, because I would have been fascinated to see.
I'm willing to bet he doesn't bring up the Euthyphro dilemma.
He 100% for sure doesn't bring up Euthyphro, but I don't think he even brings up Norway, which is a shame, because then that's the point that I really like to press him on. Because even aside from the fact that obviously lots of people have been poor atheists who've lived in bad neighborhoods and haven't kicked people to death, but even aside from that, if Norway is going to be okay, so are just regular people in Norway who are less likely to commit street crime, are the Norwegians luxury atheists? Because this seems like a kind of luxury that's realistic to give everybody. All right, let's go.
Well, I know it's easy to sneer, but still someone has to do it. And if you like, I will stop with the circumcision, which you think is a trivial thing. I mean, have you ever talked to anyone or interviewed anyone who's been subjected to female genital mutilation because of God's will? You wouldn't say it was trivial or a tease if you had, let alone to the number of boy children who die every year because of the covenant, the hideous covenant that's imposed upon them by Mosaic law, which also, I might add, celebrates every year in all three monotheisms the decision of a father to put his knife to his son's throat, because that's how much he loves the dictator. Now, I find this wicked, and I won't have my belief called frivolous. And any one of you who's prepared to show how much you love God and appreciate true north by holding a knife to your firstborn's throat to prove your devotion can stand up now or be regarded by my brother as someone who's not morally serious. And now you see the depth into which religion wants to throw you. Now, my book does have a few jeers of religion, because after all, in this bed of tears, let's do that. But it's been reviewed very seriously by many bishops, many rabbis, by the Pope's chaplain in Rome, all of whom have said as they've said about previous polemics of mine, that I make some points that they haven't yet come up with an answer to. The reason for that is because they can't. It's not in the nature of them to be able to do so. You either believe, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, comrades and friends, in the idea of vicarious redemption, or you do not. And you either think it's morally serious or you don't. In other words, you can either say, yes, I may have sinned badly, but I can throw my sins on another, and he can take them from me and die for me and suffer for me and take my responsibility away, or you don't think so. And I think vicarious redemption is the most immoral idea in current circulation. I could, if I wanted to, if I knew you, or even if I didn't know you, I could offer to take your debt and pay it. It's been done. People will do that for friends, for lovers, even for strangers. I could offer to serve your term in prison if the law allowed it. So I don't think you can do it. Probably I can. I'll serve your term. I'll do that for you. But to say, I'll take your sins away, you never committed them. You're washed white as snow and clean as new. And you can watch me being tortured and put to death as a lamb, as a sheep. And I'll call you a sheep, and my congregation will be called a flock. From then on, is a double humiliation. First, it's a hideous outrage on the scapegoat. Second, it's a terrible insult on those who agree to be called sheep. Anyone here want to stand up and say, I'm a sheep? I'm a lamb? Good for you. Anyone else? Good for the rest of you. Fine. Sheep you are. It's not usually that easy. Now, okay, why is there something, not nothing? Good question. Why is the universe expanding so fast now that it's just been discovered that the red shift of Edwin Hubble is not an expanding rate that is slowing down, as Newton would have had us believe, but is an expanding rate that is speeding up? Physicists thought the universe would slow down. No, the rate of expansion is so great now that very soon it won't be possible. Read Lawrence Krauss's piece in the Current Scientific American. Won't even be possible to work out how we ever worked out what the Big Bang was. Such nothingness is coming to us, we won't even know where we were. And in the meantime, the Andromeda galaxy is heading towards us directly. You can see it in the night sky now with the naked eye. And in 5 billion years, which is in physics time, nothing. It's tomorrow in physics time. It's here. So the something we have now is about to meet with a great deal of nothing. Some design, huh? Who designed that? The question always is the same, even without science. We knew what the philosophers knew. Anyone who claims this is a design must either convict the designer of one thing, extreme incompetence and noodling and footling and chaotic planning, and probably both, extreme cruelty, callousness, and indifference towards those whom he summoned into existence and made to suffer. These points cannot be overthrown by any kind of casuistry, and certainly were not even challenged by the casuistical efforts you just heard. Thank you.
He goes quite a distance to avoid the cosmological argument there. The question was, why is there something instead of nothing?
Yeah,
And
it's a great rhetorical bit, but it's just 100% off topic.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, especially that Andromeda argument about, I mean, then it kind of veered into intelligent design debates about, is the cosmos intelligently designed? What grand intelligent designer would do this or create such existential suffering or pointless evil, et cetera, et cetera? Why would galaxies collide with each other?
Which is a good question, and one that he brings up really nicely with Abraham and Isaac. That makes his point better than this does. It seems like it really feels like he's trying to ensorcell us with science. Right, like, oh, the Andromeda galaxy.
Mm-hmm.
Don't look over here.
I mean, the problem, there are various purposes to which Hitchens could put the Andromeda galaxy thing that would be like a real argument. But he didn't do any of that, right? Like he could, like he sort of hints at saying like he has that line, what sort of God would design that? That's like, okay, so this could be this could be various sort of versions of an argument that the universe seems to be undesigned, or it could be just a version of the problem of evil. Why, like that it's unjust to create a universe like that. But he doesn't really develop it, and more importantly, again, none of this has anything to do with the why is there something rather than nothing question.
He cites Lawrence Krauss, and that's so appropriate because Lawrence Krauss also doesn't understand the cosmological argument, right?
Yeah. So Lawrence, Lawrence Krauss. I think I've always kind of thought of like Lawrence Krauss. Have you ever seen him, speak as like a version of Sam Harris, who isn't quite as much of an asshole, but he's but he's in this this coterie, and he has this Krauss has this whole thing about how like quantum physics explains why there's something rather than nothing, because in fact basic physical fields combining in this way, that's why matter exists rather than matter not existing. And it always seemed like, well, okay, any theist over the age of 3 should have a good response to that, which is, whoa, what about these basic physical fields?
Yeah, right.
Why do we have them? Right? Like that's just a total non sequitur as far as why there's something rather than nothing. Now, I happen to think there are good answers to that, but you certainly didn't get any of those good answers from Hitchens. I think the good answer is, well, okay, how is there being something rather than nothing? How is this supposed to be evidence for creation? Once you get people to sort of draw out the argument, okay, why can't something come from nothing? Right? Why is it that that if something exists, something must have caused it? And then you say, well, because nothing can happen without a cause, or nothing can exist without a cause. Then, look, anybody at that point, that really is almost once again like the same as the physical fields thing, but in the other direction. Like I think anybody who's like not sleeping should be able to hear nothing can exist without a cause, therefore the universe must have a cause, therefore God exists. Should be able to hear that argument without saying, well, hold up, so God can exist without a cause? Like, I thought that couldn't happen. And if God can exist without a cause, then why can't the physical universe exist without a cause? And then there are more sophisticated versions of the cosmological argument that try to that basically the challenge, if you want to run a version of the cosmological argument that gets around this objection, is that you have to say nothing that blank can exist without a cause, and you have to fill in the blank in ways that don't seem like special pleading. You don't want to just say like nothing except God, then like you're not going to convince anybody. But you also want it to be something that God is not going to fall under that heading, right? You don't want to just be met with a higher order version of the same problem. I think it's incredibly difficult to plausibly fill it out. So it's to like fill in the blank in ways that do both of those things at once. So William Lane Craig, who I referred to earlier, by the way, somebody in chat pointed out I was referring to Craig in past tense, which I actually was vaguely under the impression that he was dead, but I'm sorry, Dr. Craig, if you're watching this, and I assume you are, then I am now aware that you're alive. So fair enough. But I actually, when I was applying to PhD programs, my writing sample was actually about Craig's version of the cosmological argument, which is itself a version of the medieval Islamic variation on it, right? So that's the Kalam cosmological argument, and the attempt there is to fill in that blank, right? Nothing that can exist without a cause, by saying nothing that begins to exist can can exist without everything that begins to exist has a cause of its existence, which I think is like, at least initially, I think that's like a pretty good effort, because it doesn't feel like special pleading, right? It doesn't feel like you're just trying to gerrymander the category so God is left out of it. And it sounds like a plausible principle. I mean, if I say, hey, I got this, holding up a cup of coffee in one hand, if a second cup of coffee just came into existence in my other hand in front of you, then you would be surprised. You wouldn't think reality worked that way. And you would you'd really want to know how that had happened. You would think that there was a how that happened. Like, you, even if you were convinced that there was some crazy science fiction thing that just happened there, you wouldn't consider the possibility that sometimes things just start to exist for no reason. So fair enough. Now,
there's a model of reality that's consistent with that requirement that doesn't involve God, right?
Yeah, for sure. And in fact, I think that you are. So there are two things, right? So one, this principle that nothing can begin to exist without a cause of its existence, it's entirely consistent with having with having an infinite series of causes. It's entirely consistent with having a series of causes that just loops around in some bizarre way.
Terminator style?
What's that?
Terminator style?
Yeah, right. Exactly. Terminator style. Yeah. So yeah. And the way, I guess Craig isn't so much concerned with the Terminator possibility that, it's all, he should be. Yes. Craig, since you're watching this,
if you're listening,
please address the Terminator possibility that that the entire universe is some sort of bizarre time travel loop. But if we do make the mistake of putting that aside as an option, Craig does think that there's a way to respond to the infinite series of causes possibility, which you could just dismiss with Big Bang cosmology. But the problem is, the more you look into that, the less that seems like a good way to dismiss it, because you're dismissing it with it if you think our bang is the first bang, but you could have an infinite series of bangs and crunches. You could have some weird bubble universe scenario that's like harder to describe or even wrap your mind around. There are lots of possibilities, and it's very hard to like run an experiment to test, which one of these things is true. So Craig's way, which is he's getting from these Kalam school philosophers in the medieval Middle East, is to say that we need that. Well, you can't have an infinite past. You can't just have a chain of causes going back forever, because that would be an actual infinity. And he has this sort of weird neo-Aristotelian thing about how you can't have actual infinity. You can't have infinities in real life. You could have potential infinities, meaning things that never stop expanding but never actually reach an infinity. But you can't have actual infinities. And then you say, well, okay, why can't you have actual infinities? And what Craig will bust out is these so-called paradoxes of actual infinity, like Hilbert's Hotel. So it's an infinite hotel, infinite number of rooms. Every room is occupied. New person shows up. The night manager of the infinite hotel says, no problem. We'll just put the new person in room 1. We'll move the person who was in room 1 into room 2, 2 into room 3, 3 into 4, 500 trillion into 500 trillion and 1. And in fact, if the night manager at the infinite hotel has an infinite PA system he can use to talk to everybody in every room at once, the whole process could be over in 5 minutes, and nobody has to share a room. Nobody ever has to sleep outside. And, if you're listening to this and thinking, well, what? Wait, hold on, right? I missed something. Then yeah, that's the point, right? That he thinks that this sort of thing is just like deeply impossible. Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't know he made that argument. I didn't know that was where Craig bottoms out on that point. What a shitty argument. Like,
I'm sorry, Dr. Craig. I thought the
Dr. Craig, if you're listening, I'm sorry, but that is what a shitty argument. We have our primate brains start to wobble a little bit when we grapple with the possibility of what follows from an actual infinity. Therefore, we need to not wobbles. It doesn't break, right? We can actually think through this stuff. Right. It's weird, but it makes sense. Just it's not like the normal world of tables and chairs that we're used to, but it's internally consistent. But still, it's a little hard to think about. So we're going to reject that and instead embrace the idea that everything started with some necessary, self-caused, self-existent being. Because that's way clearer, right? We all know what that means.
Yeah, which is really funny because there is like a long and rich Christian and other monotheistic religions tradition of insisting that it's literally impossible to comprehend the nature of God. The via negativa.
Right, yeah, negative theology. Yeah. Have you guys read the Isaac Asimov short story, The Last Question? I mean, it's kind of this sort of cycle or loop where they keep asking the supercomputer, like, how do we reverse entropy? And the universe is like, over the course of millions or billions of years, is dying down. Somebody asks the question right at the end of history, end of time, and the machine answers the question by recreating the universe. So it sort of answers itself in this sort of cyclical loop. But I'm just thinking of that as we're talking about this. But what Mark was saying, the negative theology question is interesting, and then also the kind of via negativa approach is also, me personally, I leave room for that as a sort of agnostic in that, the limits of human knowability. There's a good book about the horror of philosophy, or the philosophy of horror, by Eugene Thacker, talking about it's called In the Dust of This Planet. And it's a very interesting series of meditations on the limits of these kinds of arguments to really get to the subject. And I think theology has really wrestled with that. So we can move into that sort of territory, which is sort of the contemplatives territory. But on the same time, maybe to like loop this back into the pragmatic, right, into the context of this debate, is like the problem of evil, right? Like, why do people do horrible things to each other? Is it really religion's fault, or isn't it? And I mean, that seems to be the crux of the debate that they're arguing for and against here. But for us, I mean, like, I don't know if we can really answer that question. I don't think it's as simple as one side saying, well, it's because of the lack of a deity, or because of a deity, or belief in a deity. But it's I think this like kind of comes back to it, like how do we deal with the problem of evil? And I don't think either of them are really saying that explicitly in this, but rather kind of blaming one side or the other for their particular, well, it's because of God or because of a lack of God, right? But the problem of evil still kind of remains kind of floating in the center here.
Yeah, I mean, so I think the best case you can make, for thinking that you really can blame religion for some of these things is just that that there are certain kinds of like there are certain kinds of atrocities that people are probably more likely to commit or participate in committing if they're led to them by some form of really, really intense belief, in a given worldview. And you could argue that worldviews that are are kind of fused with the sense of the numinous, like religious ones are more likely to inspire that level of belief. And I mean, the counter argument, I think, would just be that that kind of intensity of belief also, leads people to extraordinary acts of humanitarianism and resisting the Nazis and and stuff like that. And so again, like Mark said, it's an empirical question, and part of the problem with debates like this is that the kind of rhetorical combat where both of the Hitchens brothers are clearly most comfortable doesn't really lend itself to just sort of slowly working through statistical evidence. Instead, it's like what you do is you pick like really flashy, striking, visceral examples, like the like various religious horrors, or like the youths in London kicking people like watermelons. But in any case, Mark, I should say, by the way, that the exact point that you just made is where I landed in the paper. That there's some bells and whistles on the way, but like ultimately, say, well, I mean, this just seems like the fact that that's like very counterintuitive to us. Like it just seems like yeah, of course it is, right? Like human, human brains evolved to deal with finite quantities of things. And so once you start thinking about infinite quantities of things, it's not surprising that we start to feel the circuits melting a little bit. Although as you say, we can have a internally. I mean, like there's a whole branch of mathematics that is about building internally logically consistent models of how infinite quantities, would work. So it's not. I wouldn't really conclude that much from the from the counterintuitiveness. But let's speed up a little bit and watch Peter's closing and then talk about that.
Peter, 5 minutes.
Unless I hope the knife at the throat was not used, and that is the point of the story. Why?
Come on.
One of the fascinating things about those who seek to sweep Christianity out of this society, and one of the things in Krista's book which is actively repellent, and the only thing in the book which I found actively repellent was a suggestion that Christianity should be treated as a form of child abuse and therefore driven out of education. One of the things these people do not seem to realize is that if you were to abolish it, it would not be replaced by a blank space. It is important to realize what it replaced. That the argument about that sacrifice was an argument about getting rid of human sacrifice and child sacrifice, then common. That what we are dealing with here is an immensely powerful force in human emotion, which existed before Christianity, and which Christianity sought and seeks to divert elsewhere. You have to give people hope when they have done things whose remembrance is grievous and whose burden is intolerable. It has to be done. And what other hope can be offered than some kind of sacrifice? The arguments, the very complex arguments about that atonement, are all to do with the discovery, as I said earlier, the attempt that we make in our feeble way to discover what it is that we are intended to do. But to mock them as if they were a matter of a man sticking a knife towards his son's throat with the idea that this was a recommended action in the manual of life is not really a misunderstanding, it's falsehood. And really shouldn't be acceptable in civilized debate to speak as if something is being advocated when it is actually being preached against. And it is, this failure of understanding of the purpose of the thing, the failure to understand that it has any good or benevolent characteristics whatsoever. When it does produce good characteristics, in the book you will find that those who are Christians who do good things are recruited to the atheist cause. No, they didn't do it because they were Christians, they did it because they were something else. And if societies do anything bad, then the Stalinist state of the Soviet Union is said to have done those things because Stalinist communism was in fact a form of religion. You can't win. It's completely secular. There is nothing that anybody can do which is religious and which is based on a belief in God, which Christians will think is right. And if anybody does anything which is wrong, then it will be God's fault. And there is no escape from this circle. And I think it's very well exemplified in this misrepresentation of one of the central stories in the Bible. Well, my fellow sheep-like Americans, is it not the case that in the matter of the Eid, the Muslim sacrifice, or in the matter of the Abrahamic sacrifice of Isaac, that the first test the father must pass is to show his God that he's at least willing to do it, that his submission can be taken for granted, even to this extent? Is there anyone here who does not think that that is the grandeur of the story, as well as what I would describe as the horrible sadomasochistic submission? Only then, only when he's shown, yes, I will do it, that's how much I love Big Brother, only then is he released from the obligation. This is the torturing. This is even worse than the book of Job. It's even worse than the toying by the dictator of the fate and emotions of one of his effortlessly made creatures. Anyone who loves this loves to be a slave. Now, on the point of morality, my brother has written very well in England and indeed elsewhere about the awful nihilism and relativism that has poisoned so much of our social and national and collective life. And I have more agreement with him on this than perhaps he understands, but to say that this is to be equated with atheism is simply to misunderstand what nihilism and relativism mean. And that's very... I think I can make this point relatively simply. Someone who says that do what you will must be the whole of the law, that's supposedly what Satanists say at their ceremonies. By the way, Satanists are not atheists by definition. Their satanic majesties are not non-entities. Is giving themselves permission to act entirely as they might wish, at their own pleasure. How does the person who says, God is on my side, act? I don't demand an answer from you. I simply demand you think about my question. How do those act who say, God is on my side? Do they not act as if, do they not behave in Iran, in Iraq, in Bombay, in Beirut, in Belfast, as if they have the right to do anything at all because God has given them permission? Yes, they do. You don't get rid of nihilism. You don't get rid of relativism by claiming you have God in your corner. Rather, you make it possible for any torture, any cruelty, any child abuse, any nightmare of violence and shame to be yours and to be proud of it too. Now, I have two challenges that Peter has despised in the past, but I'm going to repeat them to you, and you decide what you think. If you think that morality must be supernaturally referred, that without heavenly dictatorship, we would not have a moral guide, you must have an answer to this question, which I've now asked in print many times, in public many times, radio, TV, any number of times, not yet had an answer to. Name me moral action performed, or moral action recommended, or moral statement made by a believer. Name me one, by a true believer in religion, that could not have been made by a non-believer. Name me one. Think about it. I'm not demanding an answer now. You have all evening. However, you won't need all evening for my corollary question. Name me a wicked statement, or a stupid or evil statement made, or stupid or evil action performed by someone claiming God's permission to do so. You've already thought of one. Before this evening is over, you'll have thought of two or three more. The connection between religion and morality proposed by the believers in supernatural dictatorship is thoroughly, utterly, morally null and void. In fact, it's worse than that. It is an excuse for, and has always been, continues to be and will be, an excuse for worse evil than any secularist or atheist could ever have permitted themselves or others. Glad you got that point.
Peter. Oh, yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, I can think about actually an instance of something which a believer did and an unbeliever didn't do, which is that a few years ago I resigned from my newspaper when it was taken over by a man whose main business was pornography. And I was surprised the other week to see a copy of another sister newspaper owned by that same man being adorned by a column written by my brother.
I didn't get that bit. Do you mind saying again?
I don't mind at all. You may remember.
I just didn't hear it. I'm not trying to be funny.
Okay, no. I resigned, if you recall, from the Daily Express about 7 years ago when it was taken over by a man whose main business is pornography. I was slightly surprised a few weeks ago to find that a column written by you appeared in one of his newspapers.
But that isn't a response to either of my charges, is it? I mean,
You asked for one.
I submit myself to the arbitration of the audience. That doesn't answer either of my questions. By the way, I'll tell you two answers I have had, the best two. One is an exorcism to throw out a devil couldn't be performed by a non-believer. A better try than the one Peter's just come out with, but a bit of a tautology. And the second, that I got only yesterday from a very thoughtful writer of a letter from, I think, Georgia, Atlanta, Georgia, is could John Donne, one of my favorite poets, along with George Herbert, religious poet, have written those songs and sermons if he had not been a believer? The answer to that, which has kept me awake longer than any of the other ones, is that I don't know. Because I don't know how Verdi wrote the Requiem while being an atheist either. But I think that the fact that I don't know the answer to the second question means that the answer hasn't been proposed by the proposed answer to the first one, let alone by Peter's lame attempt to complain about the fact that my column is more widely syndicated than his.
Good.
Peter, did
Well,
you want to respond?
Sorry, more widely and promiscuously syndicated.
However widely I was syndicated, I wouldn't want it there.
Well, thank you. That concludes part one.
I don't think that maneuver he does has quite the same effect after the second or third, where Peter Hitchens makes his point and then
yeah,
It
that
does.
twist. That's
the first
that's
time
great.
it does have
It's
a
like a
mic
maneuver.
droppy feel, but especially when he's made a sort of lame counter to do this thing is
Yeah, you want to save that for your best line and only use it once.
yeah. You tell him that if you see him, okay?
Okay. Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, so I will say I've always thought I've watched enough Hitchens stuff about religion to have seen that line about what could a believer do the non-believer couldn't do, several times, and I've never quite understood what Christopher thought that followed from that, or what that's supposed to signify exactly. You could imagine anybody doing damn near anything, and maybe a more interesting question is it inconsistent in some way, to do, is there some moral action that would somehow be inconsistent with not believing in God that you could commit, which I guess would be maybe another way of coming back to something like the objective ethics question. I think there's a way of taking the question, to which Peter's response was actually pretty on point, which is, look, people who are secularists generally don't have a big problem with some of the things that seem immoral, from my perspective, and that seems to be not a coincidence that people who come from certain religious points of view are much more likely to have a moral objection to smut than people who come from a secular perspective. And I don't, of course, how you feel about that depends on what you think about that moral objection, but it is a reasonable response to one way of reading Christopher's question.
It's weird that for Christopher Hitchens to say that he doesn't know whether or not John Donne could have written that poetry had he not been Christian. It's just a weird.
Yeah, right.
He would have been a totally different person. So,
right.
Maybe he would have written some other poetry, or maybe he would have, gone into architecture.
It kind of gets to the point of the debate, which is what drives people to do certain things. In the context of this, is good or evil, or good deeds or bad deeds, but it's how do these things motivate us and move us in the world? And he's essentially saying, I don't know. I mean, the singularity of the individual, there's a kind of mystery there. And in a way, it's surprising that Hitchens would state that. In a way, it kind of nullifies the entire debate about, like, well, what motivates us then? How do we really know what motivates us to act in the world, or to create, or to do good deeds or evil, or create inspiring things, etc.? So I thought that was interesting that he did mention that right there. I mean,
it seems like a much stronger response would have been just say, no, of course he wouldn't have written those things if he was a non-believer. But who knows? Maybe he would have written something else that would have been equally amazing. Like that seems like it would have been a more reasonable response. Just saying, like, I have no idea. Like, okay, I mean, I can understand saying that you have no idea in that baseline sense that sure, people are inconsistent or hypocritical in all kinds of weird ways. And so, who knows? Like, it's hard to predict, whether somebody's going to be, like, write things that seem to follow from a really intense belief they don't really hold. But that just seems like the least, like, if that's the question, that seems like the least interesting question. Like could somebody, hold at least performatively inconsistent beliefs like that? Like, yeah, sure, I guess, right? But like, would John Donne most likely have written intensely religious poetry if he weren't a Christian? Well, no, of course not. Like that also seems obvious. And then, like, you could take that in an interesting place, say, okay, well, is there then a sense in which the world would be worse off, without religion, because it's led to all this wonderful art, etc.? And like, they could have done a couple minutes on that, and I would have been interested to hear what they had to say.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, guys. This was a lot of fun, which I was pretty sure it would be. It's funny because his opening statement there, I remember discovering many years ago, Christopher's opening statement on YouTube as a standalone thing, and I was very taken with it. And it does sour it a little bit to know that he that minutes before he said that, he was defending the invasion of Iraq. But it's still, it's still some primo anti-theist rhetoric, if you like that sort of thing. But anyway, this was a lot of fun. This was really good. Could very well at some point, I hope this series reigns for 1,000 years. So if it does, we'll certainly. I'm sure we will eventually cycle back to another one of these, in which case maybe we can get the team back together. Meanwhile, so as I mentioned earlier, but for anybody who picked up in between, next Sunday in the same series, I'm going to be watching the Chomsky-Foucault debate with Russ Sabriglia and.
Shit! Really? That's great.
Yep. Yeah. No, that should be a lot of fun. And Matt McManus. And then the week after, I'm not 100% sure. It's going to be Bhaskar Sankar is going to be the guest, and I think we're going to watch William F. Buckley, Michael Harrington. Nice. That should be good also.
So there's a lot of great Buckley debates out there.
Oh yeah,
it's really fun to watch him get slapped around.
Yeah, well, because he's just so snotty that anytime anybody can just catch him and not making sense, it's just really satisfying.
Yes.
So yeah, no question. And then as far as other things going on the YouTube channel, been doing these movie streams on Thursday. So on this Thursday, Forrest Miller, who's the producer for the show, and Jacobin deputy editor Micah Utrecht are going to join me to talk about Goodfellas. And as far as the actual show, the next the episode coming out tomorrow is a discussion with a libertarian named Jason Lee Bias, and then I'm going to be talking to Nicholas Kiersey about academia and politics and standpoint epistemology and a bunch of other stuff like that. So really interesting discussion. So check that out. The week after that is going to be Zizek and Amber Frost, and that's going to be the last episode for 2020. Going to take a week off and then come back at the beginning of January. Have some format changes that will be announced. So should all be really good stuff. And if you like the work that we're doing here, you want to support it, please do consider becoming a patron. That's patreon.com/Ben Burgess. So for the monthly cost of a milkshake at the 50 Nostalgia Diner in Pulp Fiction, get early access to every episode, Discord office hours, group voice chats, and other good things to come. Really appreciate the support and solidarity. If you can't swing that, please do at least rate and review where you get podcasts, and like and subscribe here on YouTube. It's very close to 10,000. It'd be really nice if we got there by the end of 2020. And I guess with that, I will see you guys later this week. So left is best.